The Chronicles branded her Unseasoned. Part 1 Lieutenant Sarah Chen stood at attention in the pristine corridors of the Galactic Defense Academy, her crisp uniform bearing the single silver bar of her rank. Around her, alien cadets from dozens of species whispered in languages that her universal translator struggled to interpret. The Zephyrian recruits towered above everyone else with their crystalline exoskeletons catching the artificial light, while the diminutive Korthak scurried between legs that reached their chest level. "Fresh meat," someone muttered behind her in perfectly clear standard. Sarah turned to see a grizzled Vorthan commander, his scarred blue skin telling stories of battles she could only imagine, his 4 eyes fixed on her with obvious disdain. Another human who thinks she can play soldier with the real warriors. Sarah's jaw tightened, but she maintained her composure. 3 months at the academy had taught her that respect wasn't freely given to humans. Earth had only joined the Galactic Coalition 5 years ago, making them the newest and least experienced members. While other species had centuries or millennia of interstellar warfare experience, humans were considered naive children playing at war. The orientation hall buzzed with nervous energy as Commander Thraxel, a massive insectoid hierarch, clicked his mandibles for attention. His voice resonated through the chamber with the authority of someone who had survived the Void Wars. "Welcome to your final evaluation. You have trained for cycles, learned our tactics, studied our enemies. Now you face the Crucible." Sarah had heard whispers about the Crucible, a simulation so realistic that some cadets never recovered from the psychological trauma. It was designed to test not just combat skills, but the ability to make impossible decisions under extreme pressure. The pass rate was less than 30%. "You will be divided into mixed species squads," Thraxel continued. "Each squad will face a scenario based on actual combat situations from the ongoing war against the Devourers. Your performance will determine your posting upon graduation." The Devourers. Sarah suppressed a shiver at the name. The enemy that had been consuming worlds at the edge of Coalition space for the past decade, leaving nothing but lifeless husks behind. They were why the Coalition had become so desperate for new members, new soldiers, new ideas. It was why Earth had been fast-tracked into membership despite their primitive technology. As squad assignments were announced, Sarah found herself grouped with beings she had barely interacted with during training. Corvin, a proud Zephyrian whose crystal spikes could cut through steel. Nyx, a Korthak engineer whose small size belied his tactical brilliance. Thorn, a Vorthan heavy weapons specialist who made no secret of his belief that humans were worthless. And finally, Yalix, a gaseous ethereal whose form shifted constantly within his containment suit. "Squad 7, announced the mechanical voice of the Academy's AI. "Report to Simulation Bay 12. Scenario: Defense of Kepler Station. Estimated Devourer assault force overwhelming. Mission parameters: hold the line at all costs." The simulation bay doors sealed behind them with a hiss that sounded remarkably like a death sentence. Sarah's stomach churned as the sterile walls dissolved into the cold metal corridors of a space station. Emergency lights bathed everything in harsh red, and distant explosions made the deck plates vibrate beneath their feet. "Great," Thorn growled, checking his plasma rifle. "Stuck with the monkey and told to fight the impossible. This should be entertaining." Before Sarah could respond, their tactical displays lit up with incoming data. 3 Devourer bioships were approaching the station, their organic hulls pulsing with malevolent life. Each ship was the size of a city, bristling with weapons that could crack planets. The station's defenses were already failing under their assault. "We need to reach the command center," Nick squeaked, his tiny claws dancing over a portable holo display. "If we can coordinate the remaining defense turrets, we might buy some time for evacuation." Corvin's crystalline form chimed with agitation. "Time for what?" "The evacuation ships were destroyed in the first wave. We are here to die with honor, nothing more." "There's always another option," Sarah said quietly, studying the tactical data. Something about the Devourer attack pattern seemed wrong. Too coordinated, too clean. Look at their formation. They're not just attacking, they're hurting something. The others turned to stare at her. Yalix's gaseous form swirled uncertainly within his suit. "Hurting what, human? There is nothing left to herd." Sarah's mind raced through everything she had learned about the Devourers. They were biological entities, driven by an insatiable hunger for organic matter. But they were also intelligent, capable of strategy and planning. The station's biogardens, They're not trying to destroy the station completely, they want the ecosystem intact for harvesting. A new explosion, closer this time, sent them all stumbling. Through the viewport, Sarah could see one of the bioships extending grotesque tendrils toward the station's agricultural section. The sight made her stomach turn, but it also confirmed her suspicions. If we can reach the environmental controls, she continued, we can poison the biogardens, make them worthless to the devourers, force them to choose between retreat and a Pyrrhic victory. Thorn laughed bitterly. Poison our own resources? That's your brilliant human strategy? At least the other species die with dignity. Better to deny the enemy than feed them, Sarah shot back. Every biogarden they harvest makes them stronger for the next attack. Sometimes you have to sacrifice to save others. The corridor ahead exploded inward as devourer boarding pods punched through the hull. Chittering insectoid creatures the size of bears poured through the breach, their razor-sharp claws and acid-dripping mandibles gleaming in the emergency lighting. Behind them came larger forms, the shepherds, biomechanical hybrids that commanded the lesser creatures with pheromone signals. Talk time is over, Corvin announced, his crystal spikes beginning to glow with stored energy. Now we fight. The battle was brutal and desperate. Corvin carved through the enemy ranks with crystal blades that sang through the air. Thorn's plasma rifle painted the walls with alien ichor. Nyx deployed microdrones that swarmed the enemy like angry wasps. Yalix flowed through ventilation shafts, appearing behind enemies to deliver toxic gas attacks. Sarah moved through the chaos with her standard-issue rifle, but her real weapon was her mind. She spotted patterns in the enemy movements, weak points in their formations, opportunities that the others missed. When Thorn's position was about to be overrun, she directed Yalix to create a gas barrier that confused the attackers long enough for the Vorthon to retreat. When Corvin's crystal armor began to crack under repeated attacks, she guided him to a defensive position where his remaining spikes could do maximum damage. As they fought their way toward the environmental controls, Sarah began to understand why humans were considered outsiders. The other species fought with honor, courage, and skill, but they fought according to ancient codes and established traditions. They accepted certain defeats as inevitable, certain sacrifices as necessary. But humans were different. They were willing to break rules, ignore traditions, and find solutions that others couldn't see. It wasn't cowardice or ignorance, it was adaptability. And in a war against an enemy unlike anything the galaxy had ever faced, adaptability might be the most valuable weapon of all. The environmental control room lay just ahead, but between them and salvation stood a devourer shepherd, its biomechanical form twice the size of any creature they had faced. Its photosynthetic skin pulsed with absorbed energy, and its multiple sensory arrays tracked their every movement. Sarah looked at her squad mates, battered, exhausted, but still fighting. They had begun to follow her lead, trusting her unconventional tactics even when they went against everything they had been taught. For the first time since arriving at the academy, she felt like she belonged. The shepherd let out a bone-chilling shriek and charged forward, ready to end their desperate mission. But Sarah was already moving, her mind calculating angles and possibilities that no military textbook had ever described. The real test was just beginning. The Chronicles branded her Unseasoned, Part 2: The Devourer. Shepard's multiple eyes tracked Sarah's movements as she rolled behind a support beam. Its biomechanical limbs scraped against the metal decking, leaving gouges that sparked with electrical discharge. The creature had adapted human technology into its own body, turning stolen systems into weapons of terrifying efficiency. Standard formation beta, Thorn shouted, falling back on academy training. The Vorthon positioned himself for a frontal assault while Corvin moved to flank from the right. It was textbook tactics and exactly what the shepherd expected. No, Sarah called out. Break formation. Use the environment. The shepherd's acid spit hissed through the air where Thorn would have been standing if he had followed protocol. The Vorthon's eyes widened as he realized how close he had come to death. Sarah was already moving, not toward the enemy but toward the control panels lining the walls. Her fingers flew over the environmental systems interface, while the others engaged the shepherd. Emergency lighting flickered as she rerouted power from life support to the magnetic containment fields used for the biogardens. The station's artificial gravity wavered, causing everyone to stumble. "What are you doing?" Nyx squeaked, firing his microdrones at the shepherd's sensory arrays. "Improvising," Sarah replied, watching her display as gravity fluctuated in specific sections. She had noticed something the others missed. The Shepherd's biomechanical nature made it vulnerable to magnetic interference. Its stolen tech components weren't properly shielded. The creature let out a shriek of confusion as its cybernetic parts began to malfunction. Sparks erupted from neural interfaces grafted to its organic tissue. Sarah fine-tuned the magnetic pulse, targeting the specific frequencies that would disrupt the enemy's hybrid systems without completely destroying the station's infrastructure. "Now," she shouted. "While it's disabled." Corvin's crystal spikes found their mark in the Shepherd's throat, while Yalek's flowed into its respiratory system, delivering a concentrated dose of neurotoxin. Thorn's plasma rifle finished the job, sending superheated energy through the creature's compromised defenses. As the Shepherd collapsed, Sarah turned back to the environmental controls. The biogardens were 3 levels down, massive hydroponic farms that supplied food for the entire sector. If the Devourers harvested those resources, they would have enough organic matter to fuel their expansion for decades. "The others will call us traitors for this," Corvin observed, his crystalline voice carrying notes of resignation. "Better traitors than enablers," Sarah replied, initiating the contamination protocol. Toxic compounds flooded the growing chambers, turning millions of tons of food into worthless poison. On her display, she watched the Devourer bioships hesitate as their sensors detected the contamination. The station shook as the enemy ships began to withdraw. Without the biogardens to harvest, the assault was no longer profitable. The Devourers had other targets, easier prey that wouldn't require such costly battles, but their celebration was short-lived. New contacts appeared on the tactical display. Coalition reinforcement fleet arriving just as the simulation ended. The walls dissolved back into the sterile white of the Academy simulation bay, leaving Squad 7 standing among the debris of their virtual battlefield. Commander Thraxel entered with a crowd of instructors, their faces unreadable. Sarah's heart sank as she saw the expressions of her alien squad mates. They had won the simulation, but at what cost? Cadet Chen. The hierarch's mandibles clicked with what might have been approval or displeasure. "Your tactical decisions were highly unconventional." "Yes, sir." Sarah stood at attention, preparing for failure. She had broken protocol, ignored established doctrine, and convinced her squad to follow strategies that went against everything they had been taught. "You destroyed valuable resources that could have been recaptured," continued another instructor, a Zephyrian whose crystal spikes resonated with disapproval. "The Coalition needs those supplies. The Devourers needed them more," Sarah replied. "Every resource they harvest makes them stronger. Sometimes you have to accept a loss to prevent a greater defeat." The room fell silent. Through the observation windows, other squads were still running their simulations following traditional tactics that the Academy had taught for generations. Most were failing. "Show them the results," Thraxel commanded. A holographic display materialized in the center of the room, showing the outcomes of all 20 simulations. Squad 7 was the only one that had achieved a strategic victory. The others had either been completely overrun or had managed only temporary tactical successes that would have led to larger defeats. 95% failure rate, observed the Vorthan instructor. "The same rate we see in actual combat against the Devourers, except for one squad." Sarah glanced at her teammates. Thorn was staring at the display with something that might have been respect. Corvin's crystal form had taken on a warmer hue, and even Nick seemed less dismissive than usual. Yalek's remained inscrutable within his containment suit, but his gaseous form had settled into patterns that suggested deep thought. The humans' tactics were effective, Corvin admitted slowly. "Dishonorable, perhaps, but effective." "Honor doesn't matter if you're dead," Thorn growled. "Or worse, if you've fed the enemy." The instructors exchanged glances, complex communications passing between species that had worked together for centuries. Finally, Thraxel spoke again. "Cadet Chen, your unconventional approach raises questions about our current tactical doctrine. The Devourers are unlike any enemy we have faced before. Perhaps our strategies need to evolve as well." Relief flooded through Sarah, followed immediately by a new kind of pressure. They weren't just evaluating her performance. They were evaluating humanity's potential contribution to the war effort. "However," the hierarch continued, "your methods will face resistance from traditionalist commanders. Many will see your tactics as cowardly or dishonorable. You will need to prove that human adaptability is an asset, not a liability." That evening, Sarah found herself in the Academy's observation lounge, staring out at the stars. Earth was invisible from this distance, just another point of light among billions. She wondered what her family would think if they knew she had just poisoned a space station's food supply to deny it to enemies that might not even exist outside of simulations. Feeling homesick? Sarah turned to find Yalix approaching, his containment suit humming softly. Up close, she could see the constant motion within the transparent material, gases and energy patterns that formed something approximating consciousness. "Just thinking," she replied, "about the choices we make and why we make them." "Your species is young," Yalix observed, his voice emanating from speakers in the suit. "The ethereals have existed for millions of years, but we have grown stagnant in our thinking. Perhaps youth brings advantages that wisdom cannot, or maybe we're just too inexperienced to know when something is impossible." "Yes," Yalix agreed. "That is precisely what I mean." Other cadets began filtering into the lounge, members of Squad 7, but also others who had heard about their simulation results. Sarah noticed that the usual species segregation was less pronounced tonight. Zephyrian sat next to Korthak. Vorthans discussed tactics with ethereals, and for the first time she didn't feel completely isolated. Word traveled fast in the academy. By the next morning, everyone knew about the human who had convinced her squad to poison their own resources to defeat the Devourers. Reactions were mixed. Some called it brilliant asymmetric warfare. Others condemned it as cowardice or barbarism. But the results spoke for themselves. Squad 7 had achieved what 95% of their peers had failed to accomplish. They had found a way to defeat an overwhelming enemy force through unconventional thinking and adaptability. In the following weeks, Sarah found herself the subject of intense scrutiny. Academy instructors observed her classes, analyzed her training performance, and questioned her about human military history and tactical philosophy. She learned that humanity's brief but violent history of warfare had produced innovations that other species found both fascinating and disturbing. "Your species' capacity for total warfare is unprecedented," one instructor noted during a tactical theory class. "Most civilized races develop codes of honor that limit their destructiveness. Humans seem to have fewer such constraints." "We prefer to think of it as being practical," Sarah replied carefully. "When survival is at stake, traditions become luxuries." It was a delicate balance, proving that human adaptability was valuable without confirming suspicions that humans were inherently barbaric. Sarah had to show that breaking rules and ignoring conventions could be tools of defense, not just aggression. The Academy's final examinations approached rapidly. Sarah's performance in the Crucible had earned her squad assignments that would have been unthinkable for humans just months earlier. They would graduate to active duty in integrated units, working alongside species that had previously considered them unworthy of military service. But graduation also meant facing the real war. The simulations had been based on actual combat scenarios, and those scenarios were happening every day at the frontier. Real Devourers were consuming real worlds, and the Sarah Coalition was losing ground despite centuries of military tradition and technological superiority. As Sarah stood in formation with her fellow graduates, she realized that her real test was just beginning. The Academy had branded her unseasoned, inexperienced, naive. Now she would have the chance to prove that sometimes being unseasoned was exactly what the galaxy needed. The war was waiting, and with it, the opportunity to show that human adaptability could be the key to victory or destruction. The Chronicles branded her Unseasoned, Part 3. The assault frigate Concordant Dawn shuddered as it dropped out of hyperspace at the edge of the Kepler system. Through the viewport of the briefing room, Sarah could see the aftermath of the Devourer attack. Twisted metal that had once been mining platforms, debris fields that sparkled with frozen atmosphere, and the dark silhouettes of bioships feeding on whatever organic matter remained. 3 days, Commander Vexhai announced, her Zephyrian form casting prismatic reflections across the tactical display. 3 days since first contact, and the system is already 90% consumed. 20 million colonists gone. Sarah studied the holographic representation of the system, her new lieutenant's insignia catching the light. Graduating from the Academy had earned her an immediate promotion and assignment to the 47th Mixed Species Regiment, a unit created specifically to test new tactical doctrines against the Devourer threat. Standard engagement protocols have failed at every encounter, continued the commander. The enemy adapts too quickly to our established tactics. Which is why this regiment exists and why unconventional thinking is not just encouraged but required. Around the table sat representatives from a dozen species, all chosen for their willingness to abandon traditional military doctrine. Sarah recognized some faces from the academy, including Corvin, who had requested transfer to her unit. Others were veterans of previous Devourer encounters, scarred survivors who had learned that honor meant less than survival. Lieutenant Chen, Commander Vexhi's crystalline voice focused on Sarah. Your analysis? Sarah stood, activating her own section of the tactical display. The past 6 months of active duty had taught her to trust her instincts, even when they contradicted everything the galaxy's military experts believed. The Devourers aren't just consuming resources, she began. They're learning. Every engagement teaches them more about our tactics, our technology, our weaknesses. Look at the progression of attacks. The hologram shifted to show a timeline of Devourer incursions over the past year. What had started as crude, overwhelming assaults had evolved into sophisticated operations that anticipated coalition responses. They're using our own playbook against us, observed Major Thrak, a battle-scarred Vorthon whose left arm had been replaced by a cybernetic prosthetic after a close encounter with Devourer bioweapons. Every time we develop new tactics, they counter them within weeks. Exactly, Sarah nodded. Which means we need to stop being predictable. Stop following doctrine. Stop giving them patterns to learn from. She manipulated the display to show the current situation in the Kepler system. 7 massive bioships were methodically harvesting the remaining asteroid mining facilities, their organic hulls pulsing with absorbed nutrients. Coalition long-range sensors showed additional Devourer forces arriving every few hours, drawn by the feeding frenzy. Conventional assault would be suicide, noted Captain Giron, an ethereal whose gaseous form swirled with agitated patterns. They outnumber us 50 to 1, and they're in their element, a resource-rich environment that feeds their growth. So we don't fight conventionally, Sarah replied. We don't fight them at all. We make them fight each other. The room fell silent, even among this group of unconventional thinkers. Sarah's proposal seemed to cross a line into madness. Explain, Commander Vexhi ordered. Sarah had been developing this theory since her first real combat encounter 3 months ago. The Devourers were driven by an insatiable hunger, but they were also intelligent enough to compete for resources. In previous battles, she had noticed moments of conflict between different bioship clusters, brief territorial disputes that were quickly resolved when external threats appeared. The Devourers are unified by hunger, but they're still individual entities, she explained. They compete for the best feeding grounds, the richest resources. Right now they're cooperating because there's plenty for everyone. But what if we change that equation? The tactical display shifted to show the asteroid belt's composition. Most of the rocks were simple metals and minerals, but scattered throughout were deposits of rare organic compounds, preserved biological matter from the system's early formation. Those organic deposits are what they really want, Sarah continued. Everything else is just filler. If we could make those deposits scarce, make them compete for limited resources, they would turn on each other, finished Corvin, his crystalline form chiming with understanding. Create artificial scarcity to break their cooperation. The question is how, Major Thrak growled. Those deposits are scattered across the entire asteroid belt. It would take weeks to reach them all, and the Devourers would notice our movements long before we could implement any plan. Sarah smiled, the expression feeling strange after months of grim warfare. We don't need to reach them. We just need to make the Devourers think their competitors are hoarding them. The plan that emerged over the next few hours was unprecedented in coalition military history. Instead of engaging the enemy directly, they would manipulate the Devourers' own biological imperatives against them. By creating false sensor readings that suggested certain bioships were consuming more than their share of rare organics, they could trigger territorial conflicts within the Devourer fleet. This requires a level of deception that borders on the unethical, observed Commander Vexhi. We are essentially turning their hunger against them. They're eating 20 million people, Sarah replied flatly. I don't think we need to worry about being ethical. The first phase of the operation began 18 hours later. Small stealth drones, each no larger than a shuttle, slipped through the asteroid field carrying sophisticated sensor spoofers. These devices would broadcast false biosignatures, making it appear that certain Devourer bioships were secretly harvesting organic deposits, while others were distracted. Sarah watched from the bridge of the Concordant Dawn as the drones performed their delicate work. One mistake, one detected approach, and the entire plan would collapse into a standard engagement that they couldn't win. "Spoofers are active," reported Lieutenant Nixtal, the Korthak communications officer. His small hands danced over controls that were designed for much larger beings, but his technical skills were unmatched in the fleet. The Devourer should start receiving contradictory data about resource distribution within the next hour. The waiting was the hardest part. Sarah found herself pacing the bridge, checking and rechecking sensor readings that showed nothing but the steady progress of Devourer feeding activities. Around her, the mixed species crew worked with professional efficiency, but she could feel the tension in the air. "Movement in Sector 7, announced the sensor operator. "Bioship Cluster Delta is changing course toward Cluster Gamma's feeding ground." Sarah felt her heart rate accelerate. The plan was working. The false sensor readings were making one group of Devourers believe that another group was hoarding the best organic deposits. Territorial instincts that had been dormant during the abundance of the feeding frenzy were beginning to surface. "Cluster Gamma is responding," the sensor operator continued. "They're forming defensive formations around their current feeding site." What happened next exceeded even Sarah's expectations. As the first Devourer bioships came into visual range of each other, ancient evolutionary programming overrode their tactical cooperation. These were creatures that had evolved in environments where resources were always limited, where competition was survival and cooperation was luxury. The bioships attacked each other with the same voracious hunger they normally directed toward coalition forces. Acid weapons that could dissolve hull plating turned against organic armor. Boarding creatures designed to consume human flesh found themselves consuming their own cousins instead. "My God," whispered Major Thrack. "They're actually doing it. They're eating each other." The battle spread quickly through the Devourer fleet. Bioships that had been peacefully sharing feeding grounds just hours earlier were now locked in vicious combat. The artificial scarcity created by the sensor spoofers had triggered a feeding frenzy of a very different kind. But Sarah knew the deception couldn't last forever. Eventually, the Devourers would detect the false sensor readings or exhaust themselves enough to resume cooperation. They needed to act while the enemy was distracted. "All ships, this is Commander Vex High," the Zephyrian's voice echoed through the fleet communications. "Execute Phase 2. Target the organic deposits directly." While the Devourers tore each other apart, coalition forces moved through the asteroid field with surgical precision. They weren't attacking the bioships directly. They were eliminating the resources that had drawn them to the system in the first place. Sarah watched her tactical display as engineering teams deployed specialized charges around the remaining organic deposits. The explosives weren't designed to destroy the asteroids completely, but to scatter their organic content into space where it would be impossible to harvest efficiently. "Charges set on 80% of remaining deposits," reported the engineering coordinator. "Detonation in 30 seconds. The explosions lit up the asteroid field like a string of supernovas. Billions of tons of precious organic matter were scattered into the void, transformed from concentrated resources into useless debris. It was wasteful, destructive, and completely contrary to every principle of resource management that the Coalition had followed for centuries. It was also effective. As the Devourer bioships detected the destruction of their primary food source, their territorial conflicts intensified. With the main prize eliminated, they were fighting over scraps and their cooperation completely broke down. "Enemy fleet is fragmenting," reported the sensor operator with something approaching awe. "Multiple bioships are breaking away from the main force. Some are departing the system entirely." Sarah allowed herself a moment of satisfaction. The plan had worked beyond their wildest hopes. By understanding the enemy's psychology rather than just their tactics, they had achieved a strategic victory with minimal coalition losses. But as she watched the retreating bioships, a troubling thought occurred to her. The Devourers were intelligent, adaptive creatures. They would learn from this encounter, just as they had learned from every previous engagement. Next time, they might be prepared for psychological warfare. The war was far from over. In fact, Sarah suspected they had just taught the enemy a new way to fight. The Chronicles branded her Unseasoned. Part 4 6 months after the Kepler system victory, Sarah stood in the Coalition High Command briefing chamber on Nexus Prime, surrounded by some of the galaxy's most decorated military leaders. The polished walls reflected a dozen different alien physiologies, each representing centuries of military tradition, and all of them were looking to a human lieutenant colonel for answers. The Devourer adaptation rate has accelerated beyond all projections, Admiral Cressistalk announced, her massive hierarch form casting shadows across the holographic battle displays. They are no longer falling for our psychological warfare tactics. In fact, they appear to be using similar strategies against us. Sarah studied the tactical reports with growing unease. The most recent engagements showed a disturbing pattern. Devourers had begun deliberately feeding false information to coalition forces, leading entire fleets into carefully prepared ambushes. They were learning to think like their enemies, and they were learning fast. The Proxima incident, General Vorthon continued, his Vorthon features grim with recent memory. 12 ships lost because we believed false sensor readings about a vulnerable Devourer harvesting operation. They used our own tactics against us. The irony wasn't lost on Sarah. Her unconventional strategies had worked so well that the enemy had adopted them, turning humanity's greatest advantage into a shared weapon. The question now was how to stay ahead of creatures that seemed capable of matching any innovation within months. What do our xenobiologists say about their learning capacity? Sarah asked, scanning through the classified intelligence reports that came with her new security clearance. Dr. Melixon, an ethereal researcher whose gaseous form shimmered with data patterns, responded from his containment vessel. Their neural structures are unlike anything in our databases. They appear to share information at a biological level, creating a collective learning system that spans their entire species. Every tactical innovation we develop is potentially available to all Devourer forces within days. Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature-controlled chamber. An enemy that shared all knowledge instantaneously across their entire species was a terrifying concept. It meant that any successful tactic would only work once before becoming useless. There is more, Admiral Cressistalk continued. Our long-range scouts have detected massive Devourer fleet movements toward the core worlds. They are no longer content with frontier raids. This appears to be preparation for a full-scale invasion of Coalition space. The holographic display shifted to show the Devourer force concentrations. Hundreds of bioships, each the size of a capital vessel, were converging on routes that led directly to the most populated systems in the galaxy. The scope of the coming battle was beyond anything the Coalition had ever faced. Current projections give us a 40% chance of stopping them at the outer defensive perimeter, General Vorthon stated. Those odds decrease significantly if they reach the inner systems. What about the new weapons development program? Asked Colonel Jaxel, a Zephyrian whose crystal spikes resonated with nervous energy. 3 years minimum before any meaningful deployment, Dr. Melixon replied. The Devourer's biological nature makes them resistant to conventional weapons. We would need to develop entirely new categories of warfare technology. Sarah studied the force disposition charts, her mind working through possibilities that would have seemed insane during her academy days. The Coalition was preparing for a conventional defensive war. Fortified positions, concentrated firepower, systematic fallback positions. Everything by the book, everything the Devourers would expect. What if we don't fight them where they expect? She said finally. The room fell silent. Admiral Cressistalk's compound eyes focused on Sarah with the intensity that had made her famous during the Void Wars. Explain your thinking. Colonel? They're adapting to our tactics because we keep using variations of the same basic strategies, Sarah continued. Defensive positions, fleet engagements, resource denial. We're fighting a conventional war against an unconventional enemy. She activated her personal datapad, projecting her own analysis of Devourer behavior patterns. Months of studying their movements had revealed something that the official intelligence reports had missed. Look at their target selection. They always choose systems with high biological diversity, not just population centers but ecosystems. They need genetic variety to fuel their adaptation process. That's why they're heading for the core worlds. Of course, General Vorthon growled. The core worlds contain the biological heritage of dozens of species. It would be an unprecedented feast for them. Exactly. But what if we denied them that feast without destroying it ourselves? Sarah's projection showed detailed plans that she had been developing in secret, strategies so radical that she hadn't dared propose them until now. The idea was simple in concept but staggering in scope. Evacuation, she announced. Complete biological evacuation of the core worlds. Remove every living thing before the Devourers arrive. The silence that followed was deafening. Several officers began speaking at once, their voices overlapping in a dozen languages as universal translators struggled to keep up. Impossible. Colonel Zaxel's crystal form chimed with agitation. We're talking about 50 billion beings across multiple star systems. The logistics alone. The cultural destruction would be catastrophic, interrupted Dr. Mellickson. These worlds contain the historical centers of our civilizations. Abandoning them would be psychological defeat even if we won militarily. Admiral Krestock raised a massive claw for silence. Continue, Colonel Chen. Sarah took a breath, knowing that her next words would either save the coalition or end her career. We don't abandon the worlds. We make them uninhabitable for Devourers while keeping them viable for eventual return. Biological sterilization followed by rapid reseeding once the threat has passed. The concept was staggering in its audacity. Instead of fighting a defensive war, they would essentially destroy what they were defending in order to save it. It was scorched earth tactics on an interstellar scale. The technology exists, she continued. Biological inhibitor compounds that would make organic matter toxic to Devourer metabolism. We could deploy them as aerosols, contaminating entire planetary biospheres without permanent ecological damage. And where would 50 billion refugees go while their home worlds are being poisoned? General Vorthan demanded. Sarah's projection shifted to show star charts of the outer frontier systems, the same places the Devourers have already consumed. Their bioships strip away organic matter, but leave infrastructure largely intact. With proper terraforming equipment, we could make these dead worlds habitable again. It was reverse colonization, taking the enemy's victories and turning them into staging areas for coalition survival. The irony was that humanity's most recent colonial experiences made them the logical choice to lead such an effort. The Devourers would follow us, observed Colonel Zaxel. Probably, Sarah agreed. But by then the core worlds would be worthless to them, and we would be fighting on ground of our own choosing, with prepared positions and known terrain. Admiral Krestock's expression was unreadable, but her tactical mind was clearly working through the implications. The political challenges would be immense. Convincing 50 billion beings to abandon their homeworlds voluntarily is better than watching them get consumed involuntarily, Sarah finished, and it has one other advantage. The Devourers are learning to counter our tactics because we keep using the same strategic framework. This is so far outside traditional military doctrine that they'll have no existing counter-strategies. Dr. Mellickson's gaseous form swirled with complex patterns that SAR had learned to recognize as deep thought. The biological inhibitor deployment would require precise coordination across multiple star systems. Any gaps in coverage would create safe zones that the Devourers could exploit. Which is why we need to start now, Sarah replied. This isn't a strategy we can implement in the middle of a battle. It requires months of preparation, massive resource allocation, and complete operational security. The debate continued for hours as military leaders, scientists, and politicians grappled with a proposal that challenged every assumption about interstellar warfare. Sarah found herself defending not just tactical details but the entire philosophical approach of voluntary destruction to prevent involuntary consumption. Finally, Admiral Krestock called for a recess. As the chamber emptied, she approached Sarah with an expression that mixed respect and concern. Your proposal is either brilliance or madness, the Admiral observed. Perhaps both. But it may be our only option against an enemy that learns faster than we can innovate. There's something else, Sarah said quietly, waiting on the Chronicles. Branded her Unseasoned. Part 5. The emergency session of the Coalition Council had been in continuous session for 72 hours. Sarah stood before representatives of 43 species, each one grappling with the most radical military proposal in galactic history. Behind her, holographic displays showed real-time tracking of the approaching Devourer fleet, a dark tide of bioships that would reach the core worlds within 6 months. The proposal before us is not military strategy, declared Speaker Nethara, her ancient Zephyrian form crackling with electrical displeasure. It is the abandonment of everything our civilizations have built over millennia. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the chamber in a dozen languages. Sarah had expected resistance, but the depth of cultural horror at her suggestion was overwhelming. She was asking them to poison their own homeworlds, to voluntarily destroy what they were trying to protect. "Speaker Nathara," Sarah replied, her voice carrying across the chamber's translation systems. "What we have built means nothing if we're not alive to rebuild it. The Devourers don't just consume our bodies. They absorb our knowledge, our culture, our entire biological heritage. Death might be preferable." Ambassador Crixtel of the Korthak delegation squeaked from his specialized platform. Despite his small stature, his voice carried tremendous authority. "Colonel Chen, your species has been part of this coalition for less than a decade. How can you understand what it means to abandon worlds that have been home for thousands of years?" The question hit harder than Sarah had expected. She looked out at the assembled representatives, seeing centuries of accumulated wisdom, tradition, and cultural achievement. Who was she? A human barely 30 years old from a species that had only recently achieved interstellar travel, to suggest they abandon everything. But then her tactical display chimed with an update from the frontier. Another system had gone silent. The Vega colonies, home to 12 million beings. The Devourers weren't waiting for the coalition to make decisions. "Because sometimes outsiders see solutions that insiders cannot," Sarah replied. "Our species is good at starting over, at adapting to impossible situations. We've done it our entire evolutionary history. Maybe that experience is exactly what you need right now." Chancellor Vorthak of the Vorthan Empire stood slowly, his massive frame dominating his section of the chamber. "The human raises an interesting point about perspective, but the practical challenges remain insurmountable. The logistics of evacuating 50 billion beings, the resources required for biological sterilization, the psychological impact on our populations. It would destroy us before the Devourers arrived." Sarah activated her presentation system, displaying detailed plans that had consumed every moment of her time since the High Command briefing. "The evacuation doesn't have to be complete. We only need to remove essential biological diversity. Key genetic samples, cultural archives in biological form, irreplaceable ecosystems. The majority of the population can remain in sealed habitat modules. Sealed habitats that would be tombs if the biological inhibitors fail," observed Dr. Melixan, the ethereal researcher's gaseous form pulsing with concern. "Tombs that might allow survival," Sarah corrected. "The alternative is certain consumption. The Devourers don't leave sealed habitats, they crack them open like nuts." The debate continued through the night and into the next day. Sarah found herself defending not just the technical aspects of her plan, but its fundamental morality. Several delegates accused her of promoting genocide against their own species, while others suggested that humanity's recent arrival made them inherently expendable in any evacuation scenario. But support began to emerge from unexpected quarters. The youngest delegates, representatives who had grown up during the Devourer Wars, started to see merit in strategies that their elders found unthinkable. They had never known a galaxy without the constant threat of consumption, and they were more willing to consider radical solutions. "The Terrans may be correct about one thing," announced Delegate Quintar from the Hierarch Confederacy. "Our traditional approaches have failed consistently. Perhaps it is time to embrace failure as a strategic tool." Sarah seized on the opening. "Controlled failure, Delegate Quintar. We fail on our own terms in ways that deny the enemy their victory. It's not surrender, it's forcing a stalemate that we can eventually break." The breakthrough came when Dr. Melixan presented new data about Devourer adaptation patterns. His research team had discovered that the enemy's learning process required active biological interaction. They couldn't adapt to threats they had never encountered. The biological inhibitors would be completely novel to them, the ethereal explained. Their adaptation process requires consuming and analyzing living tissue that has survived exposure. If we deploy the inhibitors correctly, there would be nothing for them to learn from. Slowly, reluctantly, the coalition began to accept the inevitable. The traditional defenses had failed. Conventional weapons were useless against an enemy that adapted faster than they could be deployed. Evacuation and biological sterilization might be their only option for survival. The vote was close, a margin of just 3 delegates. But it was enough to authorize what became known as Operation Phoenix, the largest coordinated evacuation and biological warfare deployment in galactic history. Sarah found herself appointed as strategic coordinator, responsible for implementing a plan that she was no longer certain could work. The scale of the operation was staggering, 37 core worlds, each requiring precise biological sterilization while maintaining minimal infrastructure for eventual reoccupation. The first phase began immediately. Research teams worked around the clock to develop biological inhibitors that would be toxic to devourer metabolism, while remaining relatively harmless to coalition species. Manufacturing facilities across the galaxy were converted to produce massive quantities of aerosol deployment systems. Meanwhile, the evacuation planning revealed the true scope of the challenge. 50 billion beings couldn't simply be moved to random locations. They needed habitable worlds, functional infrastructure, and some hope of eventual return. The dead worlds left behind by previous devourer attacks became staging areas for the galaxy's largest refugee population. Sarah coordinated the effort from a mobile command ship, jumping between systems to oversee deployment preparations. The work was exhausting, complicated by the need for absolute secrecy. If the devourers detected the evacuation prematurely, they could accelerate their advance and catch the coalition in the middle of the transition. 3 months into the operation, the first crisis emerged. Intelligence reports suggested that some devourer bioships were demonstrating unexpected behavior patterns, almost as if they were aware that something had changed in coalition strategy. "They're learning to read us," reported Commander Vexhai during a secure communication. "Not just our tactics but our preparations. They can sense that we're planning something unprecedented." Sarah studied the intelligence reports with growing concern. The devourers were indeed showing signs of anticipatory adaptation, adjusting their approach vectors in ways that suggested knowledge of coalition evacuation plans. "We need to accelerate the timeline till they were alone." "The intelligence reports are incomplete. My analysis suggests the devourers aren't just learning our tactics, they're learning our psychology. They're starting to understand how we think, how we make decisions." Admiral Cressistalk's compound eyes widened slightly. "You believe they are studying us as we study them. I believe they're getting better at being us than we are at being them. This evacuation strategy works because it's fundamentally human in nature. It's the kind of desperate, illogical sacrifice that other species would never consider. That's what makes it unpredictable." As Sarah left the briefing chamber, she realized that her proposal represented more than just military strategy. It was a test of whether humanity's unconventional thinking could still provide an advantage in a war where the enemy was rapidly becoming as adaptable as they were. The next few months would determine whether the galaxy's newest species could save its oldest civilizations through the ultimate act of controlled destruction. The alternative was extinction for everyone. The Chronicles branded her Unseasoned. Part 6, 2 years after Operation Phoenix. Sarah stood in the observation deck of the newly constructed Harmony Station, watching terraforming ships work to restore life to Nexus Prime. The planet's surface, once a vibrant blue-green jewel, was slowly regaining color as biological restoration teams seeded the sterilized soil with carefully engineered organisms. But the view was interrupted by urgent footsteps behind her. Commander Vexhai approached with a datapad, her crystalline features reflecting patterns of concern that Sarah had learned to recognize. "We have a problem," the Zephyrian announced without preamble. "Intelligence reports from the outer frontier. The devourers are back, but they're different." Sarah took the datapad, scrolling through surveillance reports that made her stomach clench. The bioships in the images looked wrong. Their organic hulls were modeled with artificial components, metallic growths that pulsed with unnatural energy. They had evolved beyond pure biological forms. "They've learned to integrate our technology," she observed, studying detailed scans of the hybrid vessels. "They're no longer limited by organic limitations." "It's worse than that," Vexhai replied. "They're not just integrating our technology, they're improving it. Those metallic components aren't copies of coalition systems. They're completely new designs that we don't understand. The implications were staggering. The Devourers had always been terrifying because of their biological adaptability, but they had been limited by the constraints of organic evolution. If they could now combine biological flexibility with technological innovation, they would be virtually unstoppable. "How long do we have?" Sarah asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. 6 months, maybe less. They're moving faster than before, and their new hybrid ships seem immune to the biological inhibitors that stopped them at the core worlds. Sarah closed her eyes, feeling the weight of 50 billion lives depending on strategies that had already become obsolete. Operation Phoenix had bought them time, but the Devourers had used that time more effectively than the Coalition. While the galaxy's leaders debated reconstruction policies, their enemies had evolved into something entirely new. "Call an emergency session of the Strategic Council," she ordered, "and get me everything we know about those technological integrations. If they can learn from our tech, maybe we can learn from theirs." The emergency briefing 3 days later painted a picture of an enemy that had transcended the biological limitations that had defined them for millennia. The hybrid bioships weren't just using coalition technology. They were creating entirely new forms of warfare that combined organic adaptability with mechanical precision. The technological components appeared to be grown rather than manufactured, reported Dr. Mellickson, his gaseous form swirling with complex analytical patterns. "They're using biological processes to create mechanical systems. It's a form of biotechnology that we've never encountered." General Vorthon studied the tactical displays with the expression of someone facing an impossible opponent. "Traditional weapons are useless against their organic components, and their new technological elements are too advanced for our current arsenal. We're facing an enemy that has surpassed us in every category of warfare." Sarah stared at the holographic representations of the hybrid bioships, her mind working through possibilities that seemed to lead nowhere. The Devourers had solved the fundamental problem that had limited them. They were no longer constrained by the slow pace of biological evolution. They could now innovate as quickly as any technological civilization, while maintaining their adaptive biological advantages. "What about their learning process?" she asked. "Are they still dependent on consuming biological matter to acquire knowledge?" "Unknown," Dr. Mellickson admitted. "The technological components may have given them alternative methods of information acquisition. They could be learning through direct interface with captured systems, or through analysis of electromagnetic signatures, or through methods we haven't even conceived." The room fell silent as the full scope of their situation became clear. The Coalition had spent 2 years rebuilding from Operation Phoenix, reconstructing their civilizations on dead worlds, while preparing for eventual return to the core worlds. But their enemy had spent the same time evolving into something that made their previous form seem primitive by comparison. "There is one possibility," Sarah said slowly, "an idea forming that was so radical it made Operation Phoenix seem conservative. We've been thinking about this as a technological problem. But what if it's actually a biological one?" "Explain," Admiral Krestock ordered from her position at the head of the strategic table. Sarah activated her personal display, showing genetic analyses of captured Devourer tissue samples. The Devourers evolved as pure biological entities. Their integration of technology might look impressive, but it's still dependent on their underlying biological systems, and biology has rules that even they can't break. She highlighted specific genetic sequences that had remained constant across all Devourer samples, even those from the new hybrid bioships. They're still bound by their fundamental genetic architecture. The technology is just an overlay. It doesn't change what they are at a cellular level. "And that helps us how?" General Vorthon asked skeptically. Sarah's display shifted to show complex biochemical diagrams that represented months of covert research. "We've been trying to fight their technology with our technology. But what if we fight their biology with our biology?" The concept that emerged over the following hours was more ambitious than anything the Coalition had attempted. Instead of developing new weapons or tactics, they would create biological warfare agents specifically designed to target Devourer genetic architecture. Not poisons or toxins, but engineered organisms that would disrupt the biological foundations that supported their technological integrations. Essentially, we would be creating a plague, Dr. Milikson observed. A biological weapon designed to cause cascade failure and devour biological systems. A plague that only affects them, Sarah clarified. Their genetic architecture is unique in the galaxy. We can target specific sequences that exist nowhere else in nature. The ethical implications were staggering. They were talking about biological warfare on a scale that could potentially drive an entire species to extinction. Several council members raised immediate objections based on galactic warfare conventions and basic moral principles. But Admiral Krestock silenced the debate with a single gesture. The Devourers have consumed over 200 billion beings in the past decade. They show no signs of slowing down, and they have now evolved beyond our ability to contain them through conventional means. At what point does species survival override ethical concerns? The question hung in the air like a challenge to everything the Coalition claimed to represent. They had built their alliance on principles of cooperation, mutual respect, and the preservation of all sentient life. But those principles meant nothing if they were all dead. The vote to authorize biological warfare development was even closer than the Phoenix authorization had been. Sarah found herself appointed to lead a research program that would either save the galaxy or mark the Coalition as the kind of civilization that committed genocide to preserve itself. The development process required unprecedented cooperation between species that had never shared their most sensitive biological knowledge. Zephyrian crystalline genetics, ethereal energy-based metabolism, Vorthon adaptive immune systems, and human genetic engineering techniques were combined in ways that pushed the boundaries of scientific possibility. But the breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Corvin, Sarah's former squad mate from the academy, had become a specialist in xenobiology during his frontier service. His analysis of devourer tissue samples revealed a critical vulnerability that the research teams had missed. Their technological integration requires constant biological maintenance. He reported during a secure conference, the hybrid systems aren't stable. They require continuous cellular regeneration to prevent rejection. If we can disrupt that regeneration process, the technology will kill the biology, and the biology will kill the technology, Sarah finished. Cascade failure throughout their entire hybrid system. The engineered organism they created was elegant in its simplicity. It looked like a common spaceborne bacteria, harmless to every known form of life except for the specific genetic sequences found in devourer biology. When it encountered those sequences, it would reproduce rapidly while releasing enzymes that disrupted cellular regeneration. Testing was limited to laboratory samples of devourer tissue, but the results were conclusive. The engineered bacteria caused complete system failure in hybrid bioships within hours of introduction. More importantly, it appeared to spread through devourer communication networks, potentially affecting entire fleets. But as Sarah prepared for deployment authorization, a troubling question emerged. The Devourers had demonstrated the ability to learn and adapt faster than any known biological process. What would happen when they encountered a threat that could potentially destroy their species? The answer came sooner than expected. Intelligence reports showed massive Devourer fleet movements toward Coalition space, but with a new urgency that suggested desperation rather than confidence. Somehow they had detected the biological warfare program. They know, Commander Vexhai reported grimly. We don't know how, but they know what we're planning. And they're coming for us before we can deploy it. Sarah stared at the tactical displays showing the approaching Devourer fleet. Hundreds of hybrid bioships moving at unprecedented speed toward Coalition space, abandoning their usual methodical approach in favor of a desperate all-or-nothing assault. The final battle was approaching, and it would determine not just the survival of the Coalition, but the future of biological warfare in the galaxy. Sarah realized that her journey from Academy cadet to biological warfare architect had led to a moment where the fate of trillions would be decided by organisms too small to see with the naked eye. The Chronicles branded her Unseasoned. Part 7. The final confrontation began not with massive fleet engagements or spectacular explosions, but with microscopic warfare invisible to the naked eye. Sarah watched from the command center of the Coalition Defense Station as biowarfare deployment ships released their deadly cargo into the void between the stars. Trillions of engineered bacteria spread through space like an invisible plague, carried by solar winds and gravitational currents toward the approaching Devourer fleet. On her tactical displays, the enemy bioships continued their desperate advance, their hybrid forms pulsing with technologies that defied conventional understanding. "First contact in 37 minutes, reported Lieutenant Nixtal, his small Korthak hands steady on the communication controls despite the magnitude of what they were attempting. The bacteria should reach their outer screening vessels within the hour. Sarah had run the calculations countless times. If their biological weapon worked as designed, the Devourer fleet would begin experiencing cascade failures within hours of exposure. If it failed, the Coalition would face an enemy that had transcended every limitation that had previously defined them. "Incoming transmission," announced the communications officer. It's from the Devourers." The main display shifted to show something that no Coalition member had ever seen before, a Devourer attempting communication. The creature appeared to be a hybrid like its ships, organic tissue interwoven with crystalline technology that pulsed with alien intelligence. When it spoke, its voice carried through the translation systems as a chorus of harmonized tones that somehow conveyed desperate urgency. "Coalition entities," the creature began, its words forming with obvious difficulty. "We request dialogue." The command center fell silent. In a decade of warfare, the Devourers had never attempted communication beyond the simple broadcasting of hunger signals. This was unprecedented. "Admiral Kress's talk to all stations," came the hierarch's voice through the communication network. "Maintain deployment schedule. This could be a deception." But Sarah found herself studying the creature's hybrid form with growing fascination. The technological integrations weren't random modifications. They followed patterns that suggested intelligence, purpose, even artistry. This wasn't the mindless, hunger-driven creature that Coalition propaganda had described. "Open a channel," she ordered. "Colonel," Admiral Kresitok specifically ordered. "I'm not countermanding the Admiral," Sarah interrupted. "But if they want to talk, I want to hear what they have to say." "Open the channel." The Devourer's image stabilized on the main screen. Up close, Sarah could see that the creature's organic components showed signs of stress, while its technological elements flickered with unstable energy patterns. "We understand." "Your weapon," the Devourer continued, its chorus voice carrying notes of what might have been fear. "We cannot adapt to complete extinction." "Then you should have thought of that before consuming 200 billion sentient beings," Sarah replied coldly. The creature's form shifted, technological components rearranging themselves in patterns that suggested complex emotional states. "We consumed to survive. As you create weapons to survive. We are not different." The comparison hit Sarah harder than she had expected. She had spent years developing increasingly destructive tactics, culminating in a biological weapon designed to commit genocide. How different was that from an enemy that consumed others to ensure their own survival? "You had choices," she said finally. "You could have sought cooperation, trade, peaceful coexistence. Instead, you chose consumption." "We tried." "Cooperation," the Devourer replied, its technological components flickering with what might have been memory patterns. "Long ago, before the hunger became absolute, your kind, all kinds, rejected us, made us monsters." Sarah felt something cold settle in her stomach. "What do you mean, before the hunger became absolute?" The creature's form stabilized as if gathering strength for a difficult revelation. "We were, like you, once, builders, creators, dreamers. But our biology requires constant consumption. When resources became scarce, we adapted, became what survival demanded." The implications were staggering. The Devourers weren't just alien predators. They were a species that had been forced by circumstances into becoming the galaxy's greatest threat. They had chosen survival over morality, just as the Coalition was doing by deploying biological weapons. Status report, Sarah called out, trying to focus on immediate tactical concerns rather than the philosophical implications of the Devourer's claims. Bacteria deployment proceeding on schedule, Lieutenant Nixtal reported. First effects should be visible within minutes. On the tactical display, Sarah could see the invisible biological weapon spreading through space toward the enemy fleet. Soon the engineered bacteria would begin their work, causing cascade failures throughout the Devourer bioships. The war would be won through microscopic genocide. There may be another way, the Devourer continued, its technological components pulsing with desperate energy. We have learned much about synthesis, biology, and technology, working in harmony. We could share this knowledge. In exchange for what? Sarah asked, though part of her already knew the answer. Coexistence, the creature replied. Controlled feeding, unwilling populations, or artificial substrates. We do not need to be monsters. Sarah stared at the screen, seeing not just an enemy but a reflection of what the coalition might become if they continued down their current path. They had already poisoned their own worlds and developed biological weapons of mass destruction. How long before survival requirements turned them into the very monsters they were fighting? Colonel Chen, Admiral Krestalk's voice crackled through the communication system. Whatever that creature is telling you, remember that it represents a species that has consumed countless civilizations. Do not be deceived by apparent intelligence or claims of reform. But Sarah was no longer thinking like a military officer. She was thinking like a scientist, like someone who understood that evolution was about adaptation, not extinction. The Devourers had adapted to become apex predators, but they could also adapt to become something else. Can you prove it? She asked the Devourer. Can you demonstrate that your species can survive without consuming sentient beings? The creature's form shifted again, this time in patterns that suggested hope. We have experiments running bioships that feed on stellar radiation, synthetic organics, waste products, but development requires time, requires peace. Time we can't give you while your fleet approaches our worlds. Then, we propose, withdrawal, return to, frontier space, continue, development in, isolation, prove, coexistence possible. Sarah looked at her tactical displays, watching the invisible biological weapon spreading toward the enemy fleet. She had minutes to make a decision that would affect the future of two species. Deploy the weapon and potentially commit genocide, or trust an enemy that had given her no reason for trust. But then she thought about her journey from academy cadet to this moment. Every successful strategy had come from doing the unexpected, from finding solutions that others couldn't see. Maybe the most unexpected solution of all was choosing cooperation over extinction. Admiral Krestalk, Sarah announced over the communication system. I'm recommending immediate cessation of biological weapon deployment. Colonel Chen, you are exceeding your authority. The deployment will continue. Sarah looked at Lieutenant Nixtal, whose small hands were poised over the communication controls. The Korthak's large eyes met hers, and she saw understanding pass between them. Technical malfunction in deployment systems, Nixtal announced loudly enough for the entire command center to hear. Bacteria release has been interrupted. It was mutiny, a direct violation of Admiral Krestalk's orders. But it was also a chance to end the war without genocide, to prove that adaptation could lead to cooperation rather than destruction. Devourer vessel. Sarah addressed the creature on the screen. You have 1 hour to begin withdrawal of your fleet. Any hostile action will result in immediate resumption of biological weapon deployment. Understood, the creature replied. We begin withdrawal immediately. Thank you for mercy. As Sarah watched the Devourer fleet begin its retreat, she realized that her reputation as an unseasoned outsider had become her greatest strength. She had approached every problem with